Good morning, everyone. I'm John Ravitz, the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for the Business Council of Westchester. On behalf of our President and CEO, Dr. Marsha Gordon, and our Board Chair, Heidi Davidson, we want to welcome everybody to this important and timely webinar that is being put together through our Business Resource Center. Just some housekeeping. This is going to be recorded live on our Facebook page. It also will, as we do this recording, we will place this on our Business Resource Center page. So for any of your colleagues who might not be able to have tuned in for this morning, they will be able to hear it and view it if they go on to our Business Resource Center page. We will be taking questions, so please put those questions in the chat box and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. The subject today is very timely. If you pick up the New York Times and see the front page, you see that there has been an agreement now in the state legislature and the governor for New York State to legalize cannabis for adult use. Many of you know, I was in the state assembly for 12 years. This was an issue that began being debated back then when I was there. And obviously it has gone through a huge process to get to where we are today. In January, the governor did state that he felt that legalizing cannabis was important for New York State in terms of being a revenue generator. And during the last 3 months since he introduced his budget, those negotiations have been happening between the governor, the Senate, and the Assembly. The bill should be printed in the next few hours. We expect that it will be, it has to age through a proper process, but from what we're hearing, they are going to debate and pass this bill on early next week. What's interesting about this, and I know our guest speaker will probably touch on this, is that it is not going to be part of the budget bills that are going to be passed. And that is something that the governor had put forth when he introduced his budget. So that, I think, is also part of the dynamics that we're seeing in Albany right now with everything else that's going on in Albany. But today is important because what we wanted to do was bring you a speaker who could not only give a little history on the cannabis legalization process, but really touch on what's in the bill and what's not in the bill, and really be able to talk about what other businesses in Westchester County now might be able to be a positive participant in being engaged in what is going to be a new industry for New York State. New York State will be the 15th state in the country to legalize cannabis. And so this is going to be a huge sea change. And we wanted to get somebody who really was on the front lines to give us this type of briefing. And our guest speaker today is Andrew Shriver, who is a partner at Cuddy and Fetter. Let me give you a little information about Andrew. He's one of Westchester's, works for one of Westchester's premier law firms, Cuddy and Fetter, a BCW member. Andrew's practice includes business and real estate litigation, arbitration, mediation, and cannabis law. Andrew is also the president and co-founder of the Hudson Valley Cannabis Industry Association and a co-founder and director of the New York City Cannabis Industry Association. Andrew helps clients develop their cannabis businesses and is a writer and frequent lecturer in this field, having presented on cannabis law regulation and industry practices to multiple bar associations, municipal official groups, and trade associations. In 2019, Andrew was selected to work with judges and court staff to draft rules for a new mediation program that is now in place for 5 county courthouses in the Hudson Valley. And as I said, what we wanted to be able to do for our members, as we saw that this bill was actually now going to be debated and passed, is to really get you somebody who can really dig in and give you the most updated information. So Andrew, thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to turn the program over to you. And again, I remind everyone, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat box. Thank you. Go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for attending today. Great introduction by way of the topic, certainly, and thank you for the kind words. This is an exciting moment for the state because we are, by all reports, probably as of next week about to join that list of states becoming the 15th state, and that's in addition to Washington, D.C., which implemented a legal market a few years back. Today, I'm going to talk in a bit of detail, and let me actually just mention one other point that John had talked about. There have been competing versions of the legislation that have been debated between the legislative proposal and the governor's proposal. Everything that we're hearing is that the legislative proposal has really stood out front in terms of what the actual bill is going to look like. And that's one of the reasons why we believe it's happening outside of the budget and being fast-tracked that way, because the governor's proposal was embedded in the budget. And so all signs point to the legislative proposal really being the one that we're going to be focusing on. That is called the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. At least that was the draft version. We'll see what they wind up calling it when the bill hits, which should be, as we said, any time. But we're going to rely on the MRTA for some of what we talk about in terms of what we believe will be in the bill, because it's consistent, the MRT provisions that we've studied, with the reporting that we've seen in terms of what's expected in the bill. Today, I want to cover kind of broadly a bit of an overview of what got us to here, and I'll talk specifically about these topics: economic and social trends confirming why New York is on the verge of legalization. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of what got us here, including what made cannabis illegal in the first place, and what's changed since then. I am going to talk about some of the common myths about cannabis, really because if you're thinking about the cannabis business, or if you're agnostic as to whether legalization is a good thing or a bad thing, my viewpoint has always been the decisions that you make are always best made when they're informed decisions. So there has been a lot of stigma, there has been a lot of myth, and learning about the difference between fact and fiction is, of course, essential, not only to business planning, but also to knowing where you stand and being able to recognize why this is becoming really normalized throughout the country. I will then get into the specific licensing opportunities that businesses in Westchester would be able to avail themselves of to be part of the industry, as well as playing a role in the industry on the ancillary market, which are those businesses that don't touch the plant. And as I'll talk about in a bit more detail, we are looking at a brand new economic ecosystem, and that brings a lot of opportunity. But first, let me focus on two primary policy points that brought legalization, likely legalization, to New York pretty much now. And it really falls into two primary buckets that I think have differentiated this past year leading into this session from prior years. First, we're going to be dealing with a budget shortfall, and we're going to need to have economic recovery in the wake of the pandemic. There is $350 million in projected tax revenues, according to the governor's office, and that should be in the first year. Tax revenues are expected to go into the billions by 2027, according to reporting from the New York Times. One projection in terms of sales revenue is $2.3 billion by the fourth year. Fox Business actually projected it could be as much as $3.5 billion in economic activity, and it would create 60,000 jobs. In addition to that, a key priority, an essential priority, and this is being reported as something that appears to be being honored, but we'll see how the details break down, is to redress the disproportionate impact of criminalization of communities of color. And I'll just give one example of how egregious things got to be, and how far we really did not come up until very recently. According to a headline just two years ago in 2018, before there was a decriminalization measure, according to Vox, the headline was "Black people in NYC are 8 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana than whites." Since then, even with a decriminalization measure having been passed a couple of years ago, there is still a disproportionate arrest and stop and frisk rate for people of color, communities of color, as opposed to the white population, despite the fact that it's commonly understood that the rate of usage for cannabis is roughly equal. The governor's position from the outset of this legislative session was specific, that he wanted to call for equitable licensing structure that offers, and this is a quote, "licensing opportunities and assistance to entrepreneurs and communities of color who have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs." That includes prioritizing licensing for social equity applicants, which could include disabled veterans, minority and women-owned businesses, people who have relatives with a cannabis conviction. The MRTA version that we reviewed also included applicants who reside in impact zones or areas affected by high jobless rates, poverty, or past enforcement activity. Again, we'll see what lands in the final bill, but we expect very much for those principles to be at play. We also see that the economic trends are pointing to the creation of a new national and international marketplace. And in that respect, I want to just give a few statistics out there. As of 2021, as of this year, nearly 110 million Americans will live in a state where adult use cannabis is legal. I want to put something up on the screen to give you an idea of where the United States is at this point. So let me just click on share screen here and hope this works. It's a little tough to do on to get the slideshow going. Well, it's not quite as fancy as I wanted it to look, but I'll see if I can expand it. So this map illustrates essentially what the state is right now. And as we see, you have not only those states that have both adult use, and those are the ones that are shaded in dark green, but you also have the states that have enacted medical measures. And the upshot of it is you are now at 37 states that have some form of legal cannabis, which means that you're left with 13 states that don't have that yet, although the news reports are showing that these states are more and more likely to come online sooner than later. And perhaps some would argue that the biggest impetus for this to be the year is this slide right here. New Jersey passed its referendum, giving a new meaning to the Garden State. My little bit of humor to interject into this particular program, but we get the idea. New York is now on the verge of being surrounded by states that have adult use legalization. That includes Massachusetts, Vermont, now New Jersey. You also have Maine, which is not directly connected, but will now be part of this contiguous structure of states. And then in the Northeast, you also have Washington, D.C. In terms of the national trends, based on the statistics I just said, you're basically at a point now where you have 70% of the nation that has some form of legal cannabis market. And in terms of the national scale, federal law has been inching closer to legalization in the past few years. In 2020, the House passed legislation called the MORE Act, which is the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. That would delist the plant as a controlled substance. That's what makes it federally illegal. It would decriminalize cannabis on a national basis. It would eliminate criminal penalties, promote criminal justice reform, allow for automatic expungement of federal-based cannabis crimes, outlaw discrimination based on cannabis use, and it paves the way for federal banking and taxation for retail sales. There's an analog on that last bit called the SAFE Act that was also passed by the House. I should mention that at the time the MORE Act did get passed by the House, and we're waiting on the Senate. The sponsor in the Senate was now Vice President Harris. So we had a fairly healthy expectation that the federal government might move on this as early as this year. That got thrown into a little bit of flux last week when some of you might have seen headlines that said that the Biden administration, for reasons that we don't quite understand, fired 5 people because they had said that they had used cannabis in the past. That strikes us as alarmingly inconsistent with what the federal position, or at least the intended federal position, had been announced to be during the last election cycle. So we'll have to see how that bears out. What we do know, though, as a matter of doing business within the states, is that there's been a long-standing rule or guideline, really, under federal law ever since something called the Cole Memorandum got put out by the Department of Justice back in, I think, 2014, basically saying that as long as businesses operate within their state's legal systems, in other words, as long as you're following the regulations of your state, the federal, and you're not infringing on federal priorities such as transporting it in interstate commerce or using weapons or being part of a cartel or anything like that, then you will not be subject to federal prosecution. It's been a guideline, and so therefore it doesn't have the force of law. However, with the trends that we're talking about and the fact that 70% of the nation now has some sort of legal status of cannabis, we view it all as highly unlikely that there would be any federal intervention unless those federal priorities were trampled upon. In addition to which, we have to consider that Canada legalized in 2018, and within 6 months, there were companies trading on the Canadian Stock Exchange in cannabis. And Mexico, that legislature has recently enacted a measure allowing for nationwide legalization of cannabis. That's expected to be signed next month. In terms of revenues nationally, in 2020, the US revenues were $18.3 billion, and that is a $7.6 billion uptick from the 10.7 billion in sales the previous year. Put another way, in 1 year, there's been a 71% increase in year-over-year sales in cannabis. There's also, according to the Gallup poll, a 68% level of national support for adult use legalization. And all of this really leads to a single conclusion. While John is right, and his words are, I think we all take very seriously, that, it ain't over till it's over. It seems that it would take a lot of lack of common sense at this very, very late moment for New York to somehow derail the process that it seems to be on in terms of legalization likely happening next week. This actually then leads to another essential question, which is, if it's so widely accepted now, what has made it illegal for at least the last 90 years? And in that, I just want to give a little bit of an explanation on the history of this. And the fact of the matter is that cannabis prohibition is actually a sliver, a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of human history. Cannabis use traces back at least 2,500 years, according to the Chinese Academy of Sciences, where it was used as part of a funeral. They had found that based on chemical plant signatures that mourners had burned cannabis for its intoxicating fumes. It's been part of ceremonies and recreational and medical use ever since then. It is listed in the earliest Chinese medical texts. And I'll fast forward a couple of thousand years now to colonial United States. One major part of the cannabis plant, hemp, was actually required in the colonies to be grown. And the reason for that is that hemp is a vital resource. It can be used for rope, fiber, clothing, paper, biofuel. It's used for CBD today. And since it was made legal a couple of years ago, because it became illegal, as part of the roundup of making all of the cannabis plant illegal, back in the 20th century, or the early 20th century, when that trend started, there really was there was no logical reason for that, because hemp itself doesn't have the psychoactive ingredient of THC, and therefore we just eliminated our access to this vital resource. Particularly when it comes to paper, compare the fact that cannabis is a renewable plant. So in a cycle of months, you can actually generate enough material to make paper, as opposed to the 80 or so years that it would take to make paper out of a mature tree, which, when you cut down, of course, leads to global climate change issues, as opposed to a plant, which is a renewable resource, which actually helps with climate change. Another sort of interesting fact, just to illustrate the point, 2 of the drafts of the Declaration of Independence were actually made from hemp, the paper itself. It's been recognized as a medicine in the United States in the pharmacopoeia since the 19th and early 20th centuries, and recreational use has also been worldwide up until the 20th century. So how did it get taboo? Why are some of us sort of still wringing our hands and saying, is this an okay thing? What's about to happen? The answer is actually very disturbing. But it's important for us to know, because this context explains why social equity is such a key part of what needs to happen in a cannabis market. And the short answer is that it's a sequel to Prohibition, the original Prohibition. We all know that from 1920 to 1933, alcohol was prohibited, and the chief enforcement officer was a man named Harry Anslinger. He became essentially the first drug czar. And when alcohol then became legal in 1933, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was about to be out of a job, or I should say the Federal Bureau in terms of alcohol prohibition. And so what happened was he created the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Interestingly, prior to that, Anslinger had been quoted as essentially saying there's nothing wrong with cannabis. This is a quote from the old days, the pre second prohibition. Anslinger, he said, quote, "There is probably no more absurd fallacy than the idea that cannabis makes people violent." Just one example. But then Prohibition ends, and he starts an anti-cannabis campaign, planting false stories in the press and radio that are designed to stigmatize the plant. And in that respect, and I have to apologize for a couple of the quotes I'm about to read, because in this day and age, they are unfathomable, but it's really critical, and you'll see in a minute why. This wasn't just an anomaly. This became systematic, what I'm about to read, this attitude and this level of propaganda. The quote from Anslinger, one of the many quotes, is, "Marijuana is a shortcut to the insane asylum. Smoke marijuana cigarettes for a month, and what was once your brain will be nothing but a storehouse of horrid specters. Hashish makes a murderer who kills for the love of killing out of the mildest mannered man who ever laughed at the idea that any habit could ever get him." Beyond that, which really, is an exact contradiction of his prior attitude, he started to tie it to race. For example, the term marijuana is actually a slang term that was derived from the Mexican reference to the plant. And there was a big anti-Mexican Mexican sentiment at the time. That's why we call it cannabis today. That's why the word itself is being rehabilitated to disembark it from its original racist roots. Beyond that, and this is the part where I kind of have to, again, apologize, but these are the other quotes that Ann Slinger put out to the public that were part of an ongoing campaign. First, there are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the US, and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. And then here's one, and again, I'm sorry, but it's important to illustrate the point. Another quote says, "Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men." So I'm pausing there because it shocks me every time I get to this part of any presentation on the issue. What is even more shocking is that Harry Anslinger kept his job as drug czar through 1961, essentially a 30-year reign where he controlled the messaging and policy, and it stuck. It caught on through the states, and that's what caused states to start prohibiting cannabis on their level one by one, and then it gets to full federal illicit status when Nixon came in 1970 and put it into the Controlled Substances Act as a class 1 drug, which is a drug alongside LSD, heroin, ecstasy, and peyote, as categorized as having no medical use whatsoever. In order to justify that, Nixon formed a commission called the Schaefer Commission, where the instructions were, find a way for me to put this drug on Schedule 1. Interestingly, the Schaefer Commission that was retained for that exact purpose came to the exact opposite conclusions that Nixon wanted him to find, because they actually did an objective study. And I'll give you a few quotes. There are tons of them from the Schaefer Commission report. One of the findings: no significant physical, biochemical, or mental abnormalities could be attributed solely to their marijuana smoking. Most users, young and old, demonstrate an average or above average degree of social functioning, academic achievement, and job performance. The weight of the evidence is that marijuana does not cause violent or aggressive behavior. If anything, marijuana serves to inhibit the expression of such behavior. Neither the marijuana user nor the drug itself could be said to constitute a danger to public safety. And then there was a conclusion that no reliable evidence exists that it causes genetic defects. And essentially, the conclusions went in the total opposite direction. So what did Nixon do? He completely ignored the report and made it Schedule 1 anyway, which begs the question, why? And now we get to the second part of what's really disturbing, and the proof that it's stuck, as if you don't need more proof than the Vox headline I read a little bit earlier from 2 years ago about the arrest rate. This is a quote from Nixon's policy chief, John Ehrlichman, who was quoted in 1994 as saying, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So 90 years later, all of the myths that surrounded these propaganda campaigns have taken root to a point where all of us were told things from elementary school on that just simply turn out not to be true. That's not an innocent result. In addition to the racial issues, which are tremendous, the fact of the matter is that for anybody who had an engagement with the plant, there were serious risks. Jobs were lost. People lost custody of their children. People could not stay out on parole. And on that, I do want to give a shout out to my friend David Holland, who is the co-founder and president of the New York City Cannabis Industry Association, who's actually worked through litigation to make sure that parolees would not be discriminated against on the basis of having medical marijuana cards. And as we'll talk about in a few minutes, there is an anti-discrimination provision in the new statute that should take care of things like that, so that people cannot, based on their use of cannabis, suffer from those effects. Let me talk about a couple of other common myths, that it leads to aggressive behavior. Well, we've actually just heard some statistics from Nixon's own commission that says the opposite. The anecdote also goes that in comparison to alcohol, if a couple of people have had too much to drink at the end of a night in a bar, and they start getting into a little bit of an argument, that's probably going to break out into a fist fight. And the joke goes that the same people having used cannabis that evening will probably get into a heated policy debate. Little bit of humor, but it does lead to this. It does illustrate the concept that it just simply is myth that it leads to this aggressive behavior. Another common myth: people say you can die, you can overdose from smoking marijuana. Not one reported death, according to the CDC, of anybody dying from using marijuana. The gateway drug theory, which some people are still, touting. Fact of the matter is that the DEA itself in 2017 quietly took its position off of the website that the gateway theory is a viable theory, the theory that use of cannabis will lead to harder drug use. Newsweek published something in October of last year on the subject and pointed out the difference between correlation and causation, and that cannabis users who turn to harder drugs will often actually start with alcohol, and that cannabis is a drug along the way. It points out also that medically, the CBD element, which is part of the cannabis plant, actually holds the ability to reverse the effects of addiction by minimizing cravings. One of the bigger myths about cannabis being more dangerous than alcohol, I spoke about that a little bit. The other piece is consider the comparative costs, right? People who drink, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's part of our society. It's part of our ceremonies, our celebrations. Like anything else, we want to do it responsibly. But we know that when we don't do it responsibly, we get these types of effects: high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, liver disease, digestive problems, cancer of the breast, mouth, throat, esophagus, liver, and colon. In contrast, cannabis, we know, has actually been recognized for its medical qualities. It actually treats conditions: Alzheimer's, appetite loss, cancer, Crohn's disease, immune system diseases such as HIV, AIDS, and multiple sclerosis, eating disorders, epilepsy, mental health conditions like schizophrenia and PTSD, muscle spasms, pain, nausea, seizures, and cachexia. I'm sure I blew that one when I pronounced it. So adult use, the point being, can exist as a safe alternative for people who prefer it for recreational use in addition to medical use. And on this, I don't want you to take my word for it. Everything I'm saying is rooted in statistics and ground in hard facts. But there was a great book called Marijuana Legalization: What Everyone Needs to Know. I think that's the title. It was put together by 4 scholars who had no agenda in terms of coming to their conclusions. It's a straight down the middle objective analysis of a lot of the stuff I'm talking about in terms of the plant and its history. Here's one of the key conclusions that these 4 authors came to. Quote, if we were making laws for a planet whose population had never experienced either marijuana or alcohol, and we had to choose one of the 2 drugs to make available, there would be a strong case for choosing marijuana, which has lower organic toxicity, lower addictive risk, and a much weaker link with accidents and violence. Yet until recently, if somebody walked into your house and you offered them a drink, that would be fine. That, of course, is part of custom and culture. If you were to offer them cannabis, you'd be looked at askance, or in a worst case, reported or arrested. And obviously, that's a bit of an exaggeration in a social setting. But it begs the question, why? And I think I think the key answer to that question comes from the history that I just laid out. It's really not, the prohibition of the plant just simply did not have to do with the plant itself. So with the stigma being finally eroded, let's get to one of the main reasons why we're here now that we've got a little bit of history and understanding about the plant under our belt. And that's what are the specific opportunities that the Westchester business community might be facing. And this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of what we're expecting to see in the bill, assuming again that the bill is tracking the MRTA, which is what we're generally expecting based on the reports we're seeing. There are several licenses that businesses can take advantage of. You can be a cultivator, a grower. You can be a processor, which is where you blend and extract and infuse, package, label, and brand. You can be a distributor. There's also a license for delivery. There's a license for what's called a small business adult use cooperative, where people can cultivate, possess, and process and sell, but only to distributors, so that it's essentially like a collective wholesaler. Another interesting point, and a vital point, many would say, is that it allows for micro businesses, the equivalent of a microbrewery, which would allow for cultivation, processing, distribution, and retail. In addition to which, as expected, there are going to be licenses for dispensaries, as well as on-site consumption. You may note that other than micro businesses and the co-op model that I just mentioned, most of the licenses issued are in their own lane. They will not be part of a vertically integrated market, so that somebody can essentially control the market from seed to sale. The exceptions to that are for medical groups, registered organizations, we call them, or ROs. They've been vertically integrated ever since they got started. And because they were the first out there who invested really in starting New York's market, the expectation is that they will be allowed to have vertical integration, but a limited number of licenses so as to make sure that there's plenty of room for people who want to get into the market as well. And then so and then for micro businesses, that is vertical because the objective really is to not have somebody that would be a large company that could take over a bit of market share. But there's a lot of argument for allowing for small business owners to be able to essentially have it all in one house. And the other piece of that really is going to turn on a priority with social equity, which is that what's called the legacy market, the illicit market, exists now. We all know it exists now. And in fact, it makes New York really one of the largest markets in the world, if not the largest market. It's just that all of the revenue from that market is flowing underground, as well as the fact that it's not being taxed. Many in the legacy market are also people who would qualify for social equity licensing. And so there are advocates, including the organization that I'm heading up, the HVCIA, the Hudson Valley Cannabis Industry Association, together with its New York City counterpart, that strongly believe that not only do social equity licenses need to be prioritized, that they're the first out to get the licenses, but that incorporating the legacy market is a key piece to making sure that New York actually has a sustainable market. And I'll explain why. Look at a state like California, which legalized, implemented a legal market, but then is struggling with a two-market system because the legacy market was in large part not given the same opportunity. Social equity licenses were not prioritized, and that would have captured a good part of the legacy market players. As a result, that legacy market continued. And it's cheaper, and people who have been using the legacy market know who it is that's selling it. And the fact of the matter is that the marketplace, the legal marketplace, is always going to be side by side with the legacy market if you don't find a way to absorb that market and to give it the opportunity. And it so happens that in the case of New York, by doing that, not only can you get to a point where you can have a turnkey marketplace by bringing in legacy market players because there already is an infrastructure in place, but you're actually accomplishing the social equity goals. Now, people who want to get into the business may say, well, that's not fair to us because we follow the rules and we're waiting to get in. The answer to that is you should get in, and there should be opportunity for that. But allowing for social equity and legacy market applicants to come ahead is actually better overall for the market because, for one thing, it eliminates the two-market system, which is bad for everybody. And the other is that it's because most legacy market operators are these small, really independent businesses, although not legal businesses at this point, they would fall into the micro business category, which means that for larger scale operations and business operators and people who really want to invest in this business, there's going to be a ton of opportunity. And you pair that with the fact that just in the last year, as I mentioned, there was a 71% increase in demand for this. And we expect that that's going to be growing. In fact, each year that there's been a legal cannabis market, as it's been traced, there has been a proportionally greater increase, not always at 70%, but we have seen it at 50%, for example. Beyond the rule prohibiting vertical integration, except in the circumstances that I just discussed, there are also rules saying that there will be no indirect affiliations allowed between license holders, which allows you to make sure that people don't circumvent that rule by, for example, forming a coalition. Okay, I'll be the grower, you and I will have an exclusive where you'll be the distributor. So there can't be beneficial ownership or sort of, LLCs set up where some people are getting the benefit from one license versus the other. And I expect that would be monitored pretty closely. In terms of the key policy objectives, I had mentioned that we want to make sure that we have a sustainable market. In that respect, they're actually, not only do we want to drive tax ratables above ground from the illicit market, which obviously would be a huge boon because we'd be automatically bringing in a lot of money that's slipping through the state's fingers. But beyond that, the tax rate that's being proposed, which is 9% plus a 4% local tax, while not perfect, it's actually better than what a lot of states have proposed, because one of the issues about having a sustainable market is to make sure that it's not overtaxed. And in that respect, it seems that New York is paying attention to that, which is why they're, part of their initial message is that, out the gate, they want to be not just, we may not be the first, but we want to be the best market. In addition to the market opportunities for those who touch the plant, there is an entire ecosystem that's going to evolve from this point for that part of the market that does not touch the plant, but is also essential to that ecosystem. And in that respect, if you want to be part of this marketplace, but not necessarily directly connected to the plant itself, I'll just give a few examples of the types of businesses that we already have ready, that members of this organization are ready to proceed with. For example, the real estate component of this cannot be underestimated. And that goes to granular things such as making sure that HVAC systems are installed for on-site consumption centers, for example, as well as for dispensaries and grow facilities, so that you handle things like odors and fumes from smoke for on-site consumption, transport for distribution, the actual transport itself. And there's a little bit of overlap there with transporting with the plant, lab testing facilities to ensure that the products have the correct quality, labeling, child-proof packaging, construction contractors. We're going to need commercial real estate brokers and landlords for dispensaries, growth facilities, labs, processing, and distribution centers. So owners of property are going to see that a lot of commercial real estate will have the opportunity to come back. And one of the reasons is, and this is important, as distinguished from ordinary retail, which you can order online, even though there will be a delivery service component to this, much of this will actually involve brick and mortar. So in that respect, we're bringing back a part of the real estate market that in some respects had been fading. In addition to that, there will be tight security needs. There'll also be a need for warehouse space for indoor growth facilities. And beyond that, what we're seeing in other states that have legal markets that are starting to mature is that as people become more and more accepting, which is happening very, very quickly, surrounding businesses in the communities where dispensaries are coming up are actually seeing, more vibrance. Main Street is getting a little bit of a boost. A good example of that, if anyone's been to Provincetown, Massachusetts recently, you'll see now that instead of a dispensary on the outskirts of town in a warehouse district, they actually have two within walking distance of each other from Main Street, both of which are doing fine. Which speaks not only to demand, but the fact that it's now becoming part of the community in the same way that a liquor store might be, and people pass it without thinking about it. And in the sense of on-site consumption, you're also talking about, your friendly neighborhood bar. In addition to which, cannabis tourism is actually a fairly hot component in other states where they have a legal market. And beyond that, we're also tapping into, we like to say that Westchester is the home of New York's intellectual capital. And so there's a large opportunity for those people who are in the professional sector. Accounting, businesses are absolutely going to need that. And again, it's a brand new industry, all the ones you naturally think about. Banking, which has an asterisk because we're waiting to see what happens with the federal government, but we are seeing in states with legal markets that that banking is being done on a level where you have state licensed banks that may not be subject to a federal charter or credit unions, for example. They are finding ways where people can also use debit cards instead of credit cards so that it's not part of a credit transaction. The legal market is going to be touched in every way here in terms of helping with licensing, with contracts, with land use and zoning, alternative dispute resolution, litigation, all things that my firm knows well, as people I'm sure know. There'll be cannabis consulting businesses for strategizing how best to get from here to there. There'll be opportunities for architecture, interior design, project management for on-site and dispensaries, as well as insurance. All of this, is common sense that it yields economic revitalization. It creates more local business revenue. And for those jurisdictions that decide that they're going to welcome cannabis businesses, they're also going to get a tax boost by the additional 4% that we're expecting will be part of the bill. On that, I want to point out something very important for anyone who might be interested in getting into the space, which is we do expect that the bill will allow for an opt-out provision. There were competing opt-out provisions as between a county level opt-out that was proposed originally in the governor's proposal. And what we're hearing is that it's going to be the more sense-based, in at least many views, local level, so that on a town or village or city basis, there would be an opportunity to opt out. But it does beg the question, since opting out doesn't mean that people can't utilize the plant appropriately within their own community in their house or their yard. And if it's going to be the case that your town, village, or city opts out, but all people have to do is drive a couple of miles, because Westchester is a county where it's very easy to cross a border between one jurisdiction and another, really what you're doing is you're giving up economic opportunity for something that's going to happen within your jurisdiction anyway, because it's going to be allowed statewide for people to use the plant. So it does raise interesting questions as to whether or not, there are good reasons for communities to opt out based on all of the data that we're talking about on this talk. So in that respect, I would encourage everybody to think about where the opportunities lie in the series of different market areas that you may be able to get into. And then the other thing that I would stress is for those of you who are in the finance side or interested in investing, pairing with social equity incubation programs, which are part of what we understand will be part of the state's program. And certainly we're going to encourage at the rulemaking level to encourage partnerships where bigger business and people with access to capital might be able to work with social equity applicants and businesses in order to help them get off the ground. The more opportunity that you have to invest in that portion of the startup market, which is going to be a huge priority for the state, I think the more opportunity the market has for success. So, and that also allows, to achieve, I think, a more general goal of making sure that all boats rise with the tide, so to speak. If New York is going to do this right, it really means that we have to avoid pitfalls where there's been discussion about making sure there's an even playing field in terms of opportunity, but then, that winds up not coming to fruition, mainly because of the way that licensing gets prioritized. So that's something that if you have an interest in the business, you may want to consider speaking with the jurisdiction where you may want to do business about the pros and cons about the opt-out decision. I think we're about ready to pivot into Q&A. I've sort of seen some chat things coming up. And I know John will help identify questions. I do want to address one question that had come forth in an email beforehand, which is whether or not somebody asked whether I'd be speaking about workplace impairment issues. This being an overview, I wanted to make sure I gave everybody the larger lay of the land. But I do want to touch on that just in response to that question. Just as somebody can't show up to work drunk, somebody can't show up to work high. And if somebody is clearly impaired, then of course the employer has all the rights that you'd have in either situation, which is to say, go home, take disciplinary action. And if it's a job that, God forbid, has a safety level component on it, then of course the employer should, take disciplinary action immediately. But just as in the case where it would be highly unusual for an employer to say, I think you're drunk, take this breathalyzer. Right? There's not expected to be any specific tests or means or measures that employers can take other than observing somebody's state and then acting based on that. And one of the reasons I think that's going to be the case is because I had mentioned that the MRT is expected to have an anti-discrimination clause, which basically mirrors what the federal bill had talked about, which is that you can't discriminate, you can't penalize somebody for using cannabis in accordance with the law. And that includes under the domestic relations law, the family law, employment law, and law, as I mentioned, for parolees and probationers. And that includes prohibitions against civil liability or disciplinary actions, such as professional licensing. Additionally, just an interesting part of that is that state and local enforcement under at least the MRTA are instructed not to cooperate with federal law enforcement unless it's by court order, which is consistent with following the federal policy that was articulated in the Cole Memorandum, which is basically boils down again to the idea that the federal government will leave states alone as long as they are following their own regulatory structures. So that being said, I think I get bragging rights because we wanted to stop my part of the talk at 11:45, and we can open it up to questions. So John, I'll kick it to you.
Andrew, thank you very much, and thanks for giving us the overview of this bill. And then again, just so people do understand, this is an agreed upon bill. The bill is being printed. There is, unless the governor asks for something called a message of necessity, under the rules of the legislature, the bill has to age 3 days after it's printed, which means it has to literally be printed. And then in my day, in the dark ages, the bill had to sit on our desk for 3 days before we could begin to vote on it. Obviously, that's the process that's going to happen now. So this bill, there was a question about how, when will this happen? all indications as of Friday afternoon, or Friday at 11:46, is that they're going to try to pass this bill early next week. Andrew, I had one question. In the bill, they are going to create a new state office of cannabis management, which is going to, issue the licenses for growing cannabis, as well as the sale of recreational use by retail stores or delivery locations. Can you tell us a little bit about more of what this new entity will be and how people are going to have to interface with it?
Sure, of course. So a lot of the answer to your question is still to be determined, and the reason for that is because much of what's going to drop down to where we are in terms of submitting an application is going to be through the rulemaking process. The latest reporting was that there's going to be a split in control on the Office of Cannabis Management, so that it's going to be 3 people appointed by the governor and 2 people appointed by the legislature. They will be invested with the rulemaking authority. And by the way, that is a gain for the legislature, and again, something that's closer to the MRTA, because the original version of the CRTA had most of the control resting with the governor's office. So the OCM will be able to essentially go into the rulemaking process. And part of that process is going to be now figuring out where the rubber hits the road in terms of licensing fees, how they're going to prioritize social equity applicants, determining how many licenses are going to be put out. And by the way, we're learning, and from what I'm hearing, the legislation really mirrors the education New York is getting from other states that have not quite gotten it right. And I don't mean any other offense to any other states, but a good example of that is Oregon. Oregon flooded its market very, very quickly. It gave out way too many licenses, and as a result, they were actually burning product because there was a glut. And we all know what happens in the rules of supply and demand in that situation. So the manner in which and the rate at which licenses will be dispensed by the OCM, remains to be seen, and I think it's going to be market driven. And in that respect, you can probably look over to Massachusetts as a state that's kind of getting it right. They had done a dispensary or 2 at certain locations. There were maybe 2 or 3 throughout the state. Now, as I mentioned, you have 2 on the street in Provincetown, because Provincetown can sustain it, or at least that would be what we'd hope so for our friends in Massachusetts. And then, in terms of, I also understand that there's going to be, if this follows through in the bill based on the MRTA, essentially a social equity czar. That businesses under the supervision of the OCM, where this czar would also be supervised by, will actually have to comply with social equity initiatives, such as community reinvestment. And that's true whether you're a social equity applicant or whether you're just a license holder in a non-social equity space. So broadly speaking, that's the structure of it. It's probably a sequel 6 months from now, or maybe more by the time they get down to the regulatory part. But I would encourage people who want to, who are interested in being part of the industry, to join in part of the discussion about what we want to see in the regulations. And in that respect, I'm trying not to be a plug for the associations that I'm working with, but they are in fact industry associations designed for that purpose. We put out policy statements that we've submitted to the legislature. You can see it on our website, that goes to these specific issues. Just by way of example, we did a paper on social equity. We put out 7 papers last week: social equity, taxation, home grow, personal cultivation, and much of that actually we're pleased to see is working its way into what we're told it will be in the bill. So.
Well, I also think it's, as we've said at the beginning of the webinar, we are going to be the 15th state to legalize cannabis. And it was interesting. I read a quote from Senator Liz Krueger, who is the prime sponsor of the bill in the Senate, and talking about New York now being the 15th state. She said, quote, "I think that this will give us a head start on a good program, because we are able to watch what other states went through and hopefully come up with something that addresses the issues and problems that other states fell through." Yeah. So again, as you've been looking across the country at the other 14 states, what are some of the key things, that New York State have probably seen that we can avoid having some of the pitfalls, and again, how that affects related businesses who might want to be engaged, who had those businesses in other states had problems with?
So thankfully, it looks like New York may be hitting a few of those things right. The first one, I think I mentioned that we're doing better than other states, is taxation. There are other states where when you combine all the taxes involved, you're getting up to something like a 20% rate of taxation. And by the way, that while it remains federally illegal, the amount that you can deduct as ordinary business expenses is severely curtailed. That's its own other topic. That's another hour. I won't bore you with that. So if you choke, the profit margin too much through taxation, coupled with the level of overhead investment that you have to do in things that are very sensitive in this area, such as security, then you wind up putting yourself in a place where people are doing this not to make money, but just so that they could say that they have a cannabis business. And I'm hearing actually that a lot of operators in other states are suffering from exactly that, with one of the primary issues being taxation. So with a combined 13% tax rate, New York is in a better place than a lot of the states. The supply and demand issue, you couldn't get that more wrong, to hurt the market as in the case of Oregon. I mentioned social equity as part of my talk. California, again, is the biggest pitfall example of that, which is if you leave the legacy market without giving them a real opportunity to come in early, you're going to have a two market system where the illegal one will outcompete the legal one all the time. And California has a huge problem with that now, because now they're stuck with that structure and they have to unwind it. Other mistakes, I think this is really going to be more of a local issue on a state basis. But I mentioned, the analog where you can put it in a warehouse district. You can say, I'm going to want this in the industrial zone, and, just sort of like keep it there. The reason to do that is really in deference to the stigma, right? My community is not ready to embrace the facts about this. So I'll do it, but we're going to marginalize it or sort of keep it here. I think that's a big mistake. Because this really can be a Main Street opportunity. But along that same line, the other mistakes that people make are not giving proper deference to community concerns, legitimate community concerns, right? Time, place, and manner is going to matter a lot. So to the extent that you have, regulations that are so relaxed that you can basically plop your dispensary, within 100 feet of a school, or church, things like that, you have to be sensitive to. And if you're already starting from a place where people are reacting viscerally based on misconceptions about the plant, which nobody's guilty as a result of that, it's just what we've been told since we were kids, then catering to those reactions by doing something extreme, saying we're just going to put it on the fringe of town, means you're missing an economic opportunity. And ignoring those concerns, you do at your own peril if you're an industry, member. So I think the communities that make the biggest mistakes are where an industry player may show up on a local zoning basis and try to sort of bully their way through, saying it's state policy, you have to let me in, for example. So sensitivity to community needs and having more forums and dialogue as opposed to just barrel rolling this thing out, that's going to be really important. And having forums like this can be really important for that too.
I want to go back because you did touch it, but we did have a question again on will the new law that is going to be passed by the state supersede local jurisdiction? Again, in terms of communities having the ability to ban or opt out retail locations or the general sale of cannabis products. And another part of the question is, can a bar or other establishments sell it even if it isn't their primary business?
Okay, so the answer to the second question is no. Separate lanes, completely separate lanes. As to the first question, this is going to be a shared level of control. And that is going to have some analog to the manner in which alcohol is controlled by the state. You have a state office that deals with licensing, but in terms of time, place, and manner, right, where we're going to allow a dispensary, that's going to be okay for local jurisdictions to retain that authority. But the MRTA actually had a prohibition against a municipality acting in a way that would make it impracticable for you to actually open your business there. So if the municipal, conditions make it so onerous that you can't actually run the business in a proper way, then in that respect, you're preempted from taking any such action, by the state rule, assuming that rule makes its way into the new bill.
One last question. How many adult use licenses will be issued to the medical RO under the new proposal?
Oh, excellent question. I can't say for sure because I've heard a couple of different things in the last few days. I think it's going to be 3 or 4 for medical ROs in addition. And that I don't have more information about that yet. But that'll be an easy fact to look at as soon as the bill drops.
Great. Well, Andrew, thank you very much for spending this time with us as we again are all going to have to immerse ourselves in this new law that will soon be adopted by the state. I think that we will probably, as you mentioned, want to continue to have these type of webinars to discuss again what some of these regulations are that again are going to fall under this new state office of cannabis management are going to have, and the impacts that it will have to related businesses that want to be engaged in this. So for those of you who are watching today's show, know that we're going to follow this, and we're going to continue to make sure that we give the Westchester business community the most updated facts on how this law is going to play out, and again how it will impact the local business and the local economy as we move forward. This is new territory for all of us, and so we'll continue to bring in the experts to really give us what's the facts and what businesses should be prepared for. So Andrew, thank you again for sharing today. Again, to everyone who participated, this will be up in our business, the recording of this session on our Business Resource Center page in the next few days. It's also been on our Facebook page too, so there'll be opportunities to come back and if you missed part of the presentation or want to share this presentation with colleagues as well. On behalf again of Dr. Marcia Gordon, our president and CEO, and Heidi Davidson, our board chair, thank you all for being with us this afternoon. Have a good weekend, stay safe, continue to wear a mask, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.